The fluorescent lights of the veterinary clinic hummed with an unsettling coldness that Officer felt deep in his bones. He sat in the small examination room, his broad shoulders tensed against the back of the plastic chair, staring at the tile floor as if the answers to his problems might be hidden somewhere between the cracks. Outside, the November rain pelted against the windows with relentless fury, matching the storm brewing inside his chest. In the corner of the room lay Atlas, 3 years of his police partner, 3 years of unwavering loyalty, 3 years of moments that had forged an unbreakable bond between man and dog. Atlas hadn't eaten in 3 days. Doctor entered the room carrying a thin manila folder and immediately knew the news wouldn't be good. He could read it in the tightness around her eyes, in the way she sat down slowly, deliberately, as if the weight of her words required proper anchoring. Had been a police officer for 17 years. He'd learned to read crime scenes, read suspects, read danger in the smallest movements. He was reading this moment like a death certificate. Doctor began, glancing toward Atlas, who lay motionless on the examination table, his usually alert German shepherd eyes gazing into nothing. "I've run every test I can think of. Blood work is normal. Thyroid function is normal. There's no physical reason why Atlas isn't eating. No tumors, no infections, no organ failure. Physically, he's in excellent health." Leaned forward, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Then what's wrong with him?" Doctor removed her glasses and rubbed her eyes, a gesture of resignation that made stomach drop. "I think Atlas is experiencing depression. Severe depression. I've seen this before in working dogs after traumatic incidents. The body survives, but the spirit sometimes doesn't make it out intact." The words landed like a punch to his gut. Depression. The same condition that had claimed his best friend's life 5 years ago. The same thing that whispered dark suggestions in the middle of the night that convinced you the world would be better off without you. Looked at Atlas, really looked at him and saw it. The 1,000-yard stare. The way the dog's ribs were becoming visible under his coat despite eating before or trying to. The absence of the spark that had always defined him. "What do we do?" heard himself asking, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Doctor took a breath. "We have options. Anti-anxiety medication, behavioral therapy, environmental changes. Some dogs respond to these treatments, some don't." She paused, letting the weight of those words settle. "There's also the more humane option if his quality of life continues to decline. I know that's not what you want to hear, but I wouldn't be doing my job if I didn't mention it." Euthanasia. She was talking about putting Atlas down. The word swam in his ears like distant thunder, not quite real, not quite accepted. He stood abruptly, walking to the window where he stared out at the rain. His reflection stared back. A man with the beginnings of gray at his temples, lines etched around his eyes from years of stress, shoulders slumped with the weight of responsibility he carried like an invisible armor. 6 months ago, everything had been perfect. Atlas was at the height of his career, a decorated K-9 officer with 17 documented arrests and a reputation as one of the department's finest narcotics detection dogs. Had trained him from puppyhood, had poured his heart and soul into making him the best. They were a team, a unit. More than partners, they were brothers. Then came the incident. Still had nightmares about that night. The routine traffic stop that wasn't routine. The driver who reached for something under the seat. The split-second decision that changed everything. A knife had flashed in the darkness. Atlas had launched himself at the attacker without hesitation, and in the chaos that followed, a bullet meant for had grazed Atlas's shoulder. The dog had bled profusely, but hadn't stopped fighting. Officer had survived that night because a German shepherd loved him more than his own life. Atlas had survived too physically. The vet had stitched him up, proclaimed him fit for duty within 3 weeks. But somewhere in those 3 weeks, something inside the dog had broken. "I want to try the medication," said, turning back to face Doctor. "And the therapy, whatever it takes. I'm not giving up on him." Doctor nodded, writing something in her notes. "I respect that, I really do. but I want you to prepare yourself emotionally. Sometimes dogs, like people, reach a point where the pain is too much. If Atlas's condition worsens, if he's truly suffering, we may need to make the difficult choice together. Would you be able to accept that?" Looked at Atlas, whose brown eyes momentarily met his before drifting away again. The dog's tail didn't wag. The dog didn't acknowledge his presence. The Atlas he knew, the one who'd wait by the front door every morning for their patrol, who'd rest his head on his lap after a tough shift, who'd greet him with unbridled joy regardless of how many hours had passed, seemed to be fading into shadow. "I can't accept that," whispered, "not yet." As he drove home that evening, Atlas rode in the passenger seat of the police cruiser, the same seat where the dog had sat thousands of times before, nose pressed against the window, occasionally turning to look at with that expression of pure devotion. Today, Atlas stared straight ahead, his body rigid, his spirit absent. Gripped the steering wheel harder, his mind racing. The department was already talking about reassigning Atlas. Captain had pulled him aside at the station 2 days ago, expressing concerns about the dog's readiness. There were already discussions about whether Atlas should be retired, whether the department should consider other options for a K9 that couldn't perform. Understood what other options meant. He couldn't let that happen. Atlas had saved his life. He'd put his body between and a knife-wielding attacker. He'd bled for him, fought for him, loved him unconditionally. How could possibly repay that loyalty by giving up? That night, sat on his living room floor, watching Atlas lie unmoving on the dog bed that had once been his sanctuary. The dog who'd earned 16 commendations, who'd been featured in the police department's recruitment videos, who'd been celebrated as a hero, now looked like a prisoner in his own body, trapped behind eyes that no longer saw hope. Made a decision that would change everything. He wasn't going to accept the department's timeline. He wasn't going to accept the veterinarian's pessimism. He wasn't going to accept defeat. Somehow, someway, he would bring Atlas back. He would find what Atlas had lost. He would fight for his partner with the same ferocity that Atlas had fought for him. He just didn't know yet that the answer would come from the most unexpected source. A silent 7-year-old girl who was drowning in her own darkness and needed exactly what Atlas could give her. Proof that it was possible to survive the breaking. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 2 weeks after Atlas's devastating veterinary visit. Was sitting at his desk in the K9 unit office, staring at the behavioral assessment report that Captain had left on his desk. The words blurred together, concerning decline in responsiveness, unable to maintain focus, risk to officer safety. Each phrase felt like a nail in a coffin. He was still processing the crushing weight of those words when his desk phone rang with the shrill intensity that always made his chest tighten. He answered, his voice rough from disuse. He'd been quiet lately, communicating mostly through grunts and nods. "Officer, this is Principal David from Riverside Elementary School." The voice on the other end was enthusiastic, professional, and completely unaware of the internal war was waging. "We're organizing a community safety assembly for next Tuesday, and we'd love to have your K9 unit participate. It would be wonderful for the children to learn about police dogs. We're targeting kids in grades 1 through 3, ages 6 to 9. Very manageable audience. Would you be available?" His first instinct was to decline. The timing was terrible. Atlas was in no condition for public appearances. But before he could voice his refusal, Captain appeared in his office doorway, already shaking his head. The captain had obviously been listening from his office across the hall, mouthed a single word, "Go." It wasn't a suggestion. "Yes," heard himself saying, though every instinct screamed against it. "We'll be there." After hanging up, stepped inside and closed the door. The captain was a man in his mid-50s with steel-gray hair and the kind of face that had seen 25 years of police work. He sat down heavily in the chair across from his desk. "Here's the situation," began, his voice carrying that tone of manufactured sympathy that had come to recognize as the prelude to bad news. The department received a complaint from a parent about the K-9 unit last month. Nothing serious, just concern about whether our dogs are still fit for duty. The media got wind of it, and now we're getting scrutinized. We need to show the community that our police dogs are well-trained, healthy, and essential to public safety. Stomach churned. He understood what was really saying. Atlas needed to perform. Atlas needed to prove he was still valuable. Atlas needed to prove he deserved to live. Atlas isn't ready, said quietly. He hasn't eaten properly in weeks. His responsiveness is. I know the situation, interrupted, not unkindly. But this assembly might be good for him. Public engagement, children's energy, something to stimulate his mind. Sometimes dogs need purpose. Sometimes they need to remember why they do what they do. The captain leaned back, studying his face. Give him this chance. If he can't handle this simple public appearance, then we'll have to have a different conversation about his future. Stood to leave, then paused at the door. One more thing, this isn't just about Atlas anymore. It's about the K-9 unit's budget. If Atlas can't perform, if the department decides he's a liability rather than an asset, then resources get reallocated. We might lose funding for the program entirely. A lot depends on this assembly. Sat in the silence that followed, the weight of those words pressing down like a physical force. It wasn't just about saving Atlas anymore. It was about the entire K-9 program. Other officers, other dogs, they all depended on this somehow working out. The following Friday evening went home and sat with Atlas for hours. He didn't try to train him or push him to perform. He simply sat beside the dog, running his fingers through the thick coat that had once been so vibrant, now looking dull and unkempt. Atlas didn't acknowledge the touch. The dog lay with his head on his paws, eyes closed, breathing shallow and slow. I need you, buddy, whispered, his voice cracking slightly. I don't know if you can hear me anymore, but I need you to fight. Not for the department, not for the budget, for us, for what we were. Atlas didn't open his eyes. Monday night barely slept. He lay in bed running through worst-case scenarios. What if Atlas completely shut down in front of the children? What if the dog refused to move, refused to interact? What if everyone saw exactly what saw, a broken animal, a warrior stripped of his armor, a being whose spirit had been crushed by trauma? By Tuesday morning, his anxiety had metastasized into a physical presence in his chest. He showered, dressed in his dress uniform, and drove to the K-9 unit facility where Atlas was kept in a climate-controlled kennel. As he approached the enclosure, his heart sank further. Atlas was lying in the corner, not even bothering to stand when entered. This was worse than had seen him in weeks. The dog looked almost skeletal, his coat hanging loose on his frame, his eyes barely tracking his movement. Come on, buddy, said, attaching the leash with fingers that trembled slightly. Let's go to work. They drove toward Riverside Elementary in silence, the radio off, the windows closed despite the mild weather. Kept stealing glances at Atlas, hopping for some sign that the dog understood what was happening, that somewhere beneath the depression and trauma, Atlas was still there. But the dog remained motionless, staring out the window with unseeing eyes. By the time they arrived at Riverside Elementary, his nerves had shredded themselves into invisible confetti. The parking lot was already bustling with activity, teachers directing children, staff members setting up chairs in the gymnasium, the organized chaos of a school event in full swing. A few teachers waved enthusiastically when they saw the police car, managed to wave back, though the gesture felt stiff and false. He loaded Atlas's vest, the ceremonial K-9 unit vest that proclaimed his status as a police officer, and led the dog toward the gymnasium entrance. Atlas moved because the leash directed him, but there was no enthusiasm, no recognition of the importance of this moment. The dog had performed hundreds of public demonstrations in his career. He'd always loved them, the attention, the praise, the sense of purpose. Today, he looked like a prisoner being led to execution. As they entered the gymnasium, dozens of young faces turned toward them with expressions of wonder and excitement. The children gasped, pointed, and began murmuring in that excited way children do when confronted with something larger than life. A police dog in full uniform, representing authority and strength and everything a child found impressive, took his position at the center of the gym, Atlas sitting beside him with about as much enthusiasm as a statue. The assembled children quieted, waiting for the presentation to begin. Could feel Principal watching from the side of the gymnasium, his expression attentive and hopeful. This was it, the moment that would determine everything. The moment that would decide whether Atlas had a future or whether this was his final public appearance before the department made the difficult decision they'd been quietly discussing. Opened his mouth to begin his prepared speech, his throat suddenly dry, his mind racing. Somewhere in the gymnasium, a child was watching, a child who would change everything, a child who would need Atlas as much as Atlas needed her, but neither of them knew it yet. Neither of them knew that in this gymnasium, destiny was about to announce itself. Emma woke up that Tuesday morning to the sound of her mother crying in the kitchen. She didn't need to get out of bed to know what was happening. Her mother had been crying every morning for the past 3 weeks, ever since Emma's father had moved into the apartment on the other side of town. Emma pulled the blanket over her head, creating a cocoon of darkness where the world couldn't reach her. If she stayed under here long enough, maybe the hurt would stop. Maybe everything would go back to the way it used to be. But it wouldn't. Emma knew that with the certainty that only a 7-year-old could possess, the kind of absolute knowing that came from a shattered world that had stopped making sense. She was supposed to get up. She was supposed to get dressed for school. She was supposed to go to Riverside Elementary and pretend that everything was normal, that her parents' separation hadn't fractured something fundamental inside her, that she could still function like the other children. But functioning required energy, and energy required hope, and hope had become a luxury Emma could no longer afford. Her mother appeared in the doorway, her eyes puffy and red, her dark hair, so similar to Emma's own, pulled back into a messy bun. "Emma, honey, you need to get ready for school. It's already 7:30. Emma didn't respond. She couldn't respond. The words that used to flow so easily from her mouth had somehow gotten stuck somewhere between her heart and her throat, crystallized into a lump of grief and confusion that she couldn't dislodge no matter how hard she tried. 3 weeks ago, before the separation, Emma had been a chatterbox. Her teacher at her old school used to joke that Emma had a comment about everything. She'd raise her hand enthusiastically during class discussions. She'd call out greetings to her friends in the hallway. She'd sing in the shower and hum while doing her homework. Her father used to call her me his little parrot, because she never stopped talking. But that was before everything fell apart. The divorce announcement had come on a Thursday evening. Her parents had sat her down on the couch, the same couch where they'd watched movies together, where her father had taught her to play card games, where she'd felt safe. Her mother's voice had been shaking. Her father's eyes had been wet. And somewhere in the middle of their careful explanations about how this wasn't about you and we both love you very much, something inside Emma had simply shut down. The words had disappeared. It wasn't a conscious decision. Emma hadn't woken up the next morning and decided that she wouldn't speak anymore. It was more like her voice had recognized that speaking hurt, that expressing anything, wanting anything, hopping for anything, only led to more pain. So her voice had gone quiet, and 3 weeks later it still hadn't come back. Emma pulled on her school uniform, a gray skirt and white blouse that felt like a costume she was wearing to pretend to be a normal child. She brushed her teeth, avoiding her own reflection in the mirror. Looking at herself meant seeing the sadness in her eyes, the tightness around her mouth, the physical manifestation of the breaking that had happened inside. Her mother drove her to Riverside Elementary in silence. Emma stared out the window at the familiar route, watching neighborhoods pass by. This was her 3rd week at this new school. Her mother had decided that a fresh start would be good for both of them, so they'd moved closer to her mother's new job. New apartment, new school, new everything, except the same hollow emptiness that followed Emma like a shadow. Your teacher called me yesterday," her mother said carefully as they pulled into the drop-off lane. "She's concerned that you haven't participated much in class. She wants to set up a meeting with the school counselor. Is there anything you want to tell me, sweetheart?" Emma shook her head. There was everything she wanted to say and nothing she could say at the same time. How could she explain that words felt heavy? That speaking felt like betrayal. Betrayal of the fact that things had changed, that her family wasn't intact anymore, that nothing would ever be the same. How could she explain that silence felt safer than truth? "Okay," her mother said softly, reaching over to squeeze Emma's hand. "I love you, baby. Try to have a good day at school." Emma grabbed her backpack and stepped out of the car, watching her mother drive away. She stood in the school courtyard, surrounded by other children laughing and running and playing, and felt completely, utterly alone. Mrs. greeted her at the classroom door with an overly bright smile that Emma recognized as the concerned teacher smile. Throughout the morning, Emma sat at her desk and completed her work: math problems, spelling exercises, a writing assignment about what I love about my family. She left that one blank. She couldn't write the lie and she couldn't write the truth. By mid-morning, Emma heard an announcement echoing through the loudspeaker. "All grades 1 through 3, please proceed to the gymnasium for the community safety assembly." Emma filed into the gymnasium with her classmates, finding a seat on the bleachers. The gym was already filling with children, teachers positioning themselves around the perimeter. Emma sat slightly apart from her classmates, as she had begun doing instinctively. Solitude felt safer than the pressure of social interaction, safer than the expectation to smile and participate and pretend. Principal was setting up a podium at the front of the gymnasium. Emma watched with mild curiosity as a police officer led a large German shepherd into the gym. The dog was impressive, massive and muscular, with alert eyes and a commanding presence. The children around Emma erupted in excited whispers and gasps. A few teachers had to quiet them down. Emma felt something stir inside her chest, not quite hope, not quite interest, but a small shift in the numbness that had become her constant companion. There was something about the dog that caught her attention, something in its demeanor, in the way it moved beside the officer. The police officer began his presentation, his voice loud and enthusiastic, describing the K-9 unit and the dog's role in police work. Other children leaned forward eagerly, fascinated by the stories of arrests and heroic interventions. But Emma noticed something the other children didn't seem to see. The dog wasn't interested. The dog's eyes were distant, unfocused, moving across the crowd without really seeing. When children reached out to pet the dog, it didn't pull away, but it didn't lean into their touch either. The dog stood beside the officer like a statue, breathing, existing, but not truly present. Emma recognized the look in the dog's eyes, because she saw it in her own mirror every morning. This dog was broken. This dog was lost. This dog understood what it meant to exist in a world that no longer made sense. And watching that dog, watching that beautiful creature that was clearly suffering in exactly the way Emma was suffering, something shifted inside her. She wasn't the only one who had stopped. Without consciously deciding to do so, Emma stood up. She walked to the back of the gymnasium and sat alone on the bleachers, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't trying to get the dog's attention. She was simply sitting with the knowledge that somewhere in this gymnasium, there was another being who understood the weight of silence, the burden of breaking, the loneliness of being trapped inside yourself. And she wasn't quite ready to be completely alone anymore. Officer was 3 minutes into his presentation when he noticed his hands were shaking. He gripped the microphone, forcing his voice to remain steady as he described Atlas's role in narcotics detection and criminal apprehension. The gymnasium was packed, easily 200 children, plus teachers and staff members lining the walls. The air smelled like a mixture of elementary school chalk dust, cafeteria food, and the particular brand of energy that only a gymnasium full of excited children could produce. Beside him, Atlas stood in perfect position, his ceremonial vest gleaming under the gymnasium lights. To the untrained eye, the dog looked magnificent, powerful, professional, but could feel the tremor in the leash, a barely perceptible vibration that indicated Atlas's anxiety. The dog's breathing was shallow. His pupils were dilated, recognized the signs of a dog in distress, even if the audience didn't. Atlas has received extensive training, continued, hearing his own voice as if from a distance. He can detect narcotics with 98% accuracy and has participated in over 100 successful police operations. The words were hollow, rehearsed, designed to impress an audience of 7-year-olds who mostly just wanted to pet the big dog and go back to their classrooms. Made the mistake of looking at Captain, who stood near the gymnasium entrance with his arms crossed. The captain's expression was unreadable, but understood the message implicit in his posture: perform or else. He turned back to his presentation, determined to push through. Does anyone have questions about police dogs? Hands shot up immediately. A boy in the third row wanted to know if Atlas could fight bad guys. A girl with pigtails asked if the dog could talk. A teacher called on a child asking what Atlas ate for breakfast. Answered each question with automatic precision, his mind operating on autopilot while his heart wrestled with the crushing reality that Atlas wasn't going to make it through this. The dog was shutting down. Could feel it happening in real time. The increasing tension in the leash, the way Atlas's breathing had become almost imperceptible, the complete absence of the dog's usual focus. This was a disaster. This was the final nail in the coffin. This was the moment when everything came crashing down. Then something changed. Didn't notice it immediately. He was in the middle of answering another question when something caught in his peripheral vision: a child moving. A small figure rising from the bleachers in the back of the gymnasium and walking away from the crowd, away from the other children, toward the empty bleachers at the far end of the gym. It was a girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with long dark hair and an expression of such profound sadness that's breath caught in his throat. She sat down alone, removing herself from the crowd, creating a pocket of isolation in the midst of chaos. He recognized that expression because he'd seen it in his bathroom mirror every morning for the past 3 weeks. But what happened next was inexplicable. Atlas's head snapped up. The dog's ears perked forward with sudden intensity. His entire body went rigid, every muscle tensing with what looked like recognition. For the first time in weeks, possibly the first time since the incident 6 months ago, Atlas was paying attention to something. The dog's dark eyes locked onto the small figure sitting alone on the back bleachers. "Excuse me," started to say, but before he could complete the sentence, Atlas moved. The dog didn't run. He didn't lunge. He simply stood up and walked, with deliberate, purposeful strides, away from the crowd of excited children, directly toward the girl sitting alone on the bleachers. The leash went slack in his hand because he was too shocked to hold it properly, too stunned to process what was happening. The gymnasium fell silent. 200 children stopped talking. Teachers leaned forward. Principal's mouth fell open. All attention shifted from Officer and his prepared presentation to the German Shepherd moving across the gymnasium with the certainty of a dog possessed by some higher purpose. Found himself following Atlas, drawn forward by the leash, unable to do anything but watch what was happening. This wasn't in the script. This wasn't part of the presentation. This was something else entirely, something raw and real and utterly beyond control or understanding. Atlas reached the bleachers where the girl sat alone. The dog didn't hesitate. He climbed up onto the bleachers with surprising grace for a 70-pound animal and positioned his massive head directly on the girl's lap. Her small hands trembled as she reached down, fingers making contact with the dog's fur. And then, so quietly that almost missed it, the girl whispered something. 3 words that seemed to carry the weight of entire worlds. "I know, boy." Sneeze nearly buckled. He stood frozen, watching as Atlas's tail began to wag, slowly at first, as if the mechanism had become rusty from disuse, then with increasing confidence. The dog closed his eyes, pressing his head more firmly against the girl's lap, and her small arms came up to wrap around the dog's neck. In that moment, something transcendent happened. 2 broken beings found each other in a gymnasium full of children, and in that connection, some invisible shift occurred, as if the universe had suddenly rearranged itself to make room for healing. Teachers were frantically pulling out phones to record the moment. Children were whispering excitedly. Principal was rushing toward with questions on his face, but barely heard any of it. All he could see was Atlas, his broken partner, with his eyes closed and his tail wagging, finding comfort in the presence of a child who seemed to understand his pain on some level that transcended words or logic. And the girl, the small, silent child, was pressing her face against the dog's coat, and tears were streaming down her cheeks, and her lips were moving, and she was whispering something else that couldn't quite hear but somehow understood anyway. She was saying, "You're not alone, I'm not alone, we're not alone." Felt something crack open inside his chest, a fissure in the protective wall he'd built around his heart over the past weeks. His vision blurred with unexpected tears. He realized in that moment that he'd been praying for a miracle, and the miracle had arrived not in the form of medication or therapy or the passage of time, but in the intersection of 2 lonely souls who recognized each other. In the moment when a broken dog and a silent girl found each other in a gymnasium full of witnesses, the healing began. Captain was watching from his position by the gymnasium entrance, and even from across the room, could see the shock on his superior's face. The realization that something extraordinary had just occurred, something that transcended police presentations and public relations and departmental budgets. Principal had stopped his advance and was standing still, just watching, his expression transformed from concern to wonder. And Atlas's beloved partner began to live again. The gymnasium assembly had ended exactly 7 minutes after Atlas walked to the back bleachers. Principal had thanked officer, dismissed the children, and quietly pulled aside to ask about the remarkable connection between Atlas and the small girl in the back. Had provided her name, Emma, and he'd asked for something unprecedented, access to the school for private sessions between Atlas and Emma. To his surprise, Principal had agreed almost immediately, as if she'd been waiting for someone to ask, as if she'd recognized the extraordinary nature of what had transpired and understood that it needed to be protected and nurtured rather than dismissed as coincidence. Now, exactly 2 weeks later, sat in the school's counseling office on a Tuesday afternoon, watching through a one-way mirror as Emma sat on the floor beside Atlas. The office smelled like lavender and books, calming since that the school counselor, Dr. Reeves, used deliberately to create a safe space for struggling children. Dr. Reeves stood beside, her clipboard clutched against her chest, her expression thoughtful as she observed the interaction below. "She hasn't spoken to anyone else at the school," Dr. Reeves whispered, though she needn't have. The one-way mirror ensured that Emma couldn't hear them. "Not to teachers, not to classmates, not to me during our formal sessions, but with the dog." Emma's hand moved slowly across Atlas's back, her small fingers tracing the curve of his spine beneath his thick coat. Her lips were moving, could see them forming words, though no sound penetrated the observation room. Atlas remained perfectly still, his entire body oriented toward the girl, his attention fixed on her with an intensity that hadn't witnessed in months. "What do you think she's saying?" asked quietly. Dr. Reeves adjusted her glasses. "Based on her body language and what I've observed during the past 2 sessions, I'd guess she's talking about her feelings, possibly about her parents' separation, maybe about feeling invisible or unheard." Nodded. The girl's mother had called the school that first week, providing background information about Emma's selective mutism. The silence had begun immediately after her parents' separation announcement. Emma's father had moved 3 states away for a new job, a transfer that had seemed to crystallize the reality that her family structure had fundamentally changed and could not be repaired. Emma had chosen silence as her response to that unbearable truth. In the observation room, watched as Emma leaned against Atlas's side, her small body pressed against the dog's muscular frame. Atlas turned his head slightly, his muzzle touching the top of Emma's head, a gesture of tenderness that made his throat tighten. The dog had been trained to maintain certain behavioral boundaries with strangers, yet with Emma, Atlas was breaking all those rules. The dog was simply present, connected, witnessing. "There's something remarkable happening here," Dr. Reeves said, making notes on her clipboard. "Emma's selective mutism is a psychological response to trauma. She's unconsciously chosen not to speak because speaking feels unsafe. But with Atlas, she's finding a way to express herself without words. She's practicing communication in a space where judgment is impossible." "Atlas is doing the same thing," observed. The dog had eaten well at breakfast for the first time in weeks. The tremor in his movements had diminished. His coat was beginning to regain its shine. He experienced trauma too. He's learning that connection doesn't have to hurt. Dr. Reeves glanced at with an expression of gentle understanding. "You're both learning that, aren't you?" Didn't respond. He couldn't respond. Because she was right, and admitting it felt like opening a door he'd kept carefully sealed since the incident. The following week, during their 3rd session, something shifted again. Emma arrived at the counseling office on Wednesday afternoon and immediately sat down beside Atlas. The dog's tail began wagging before she was even fully seated, a greeting that spoke volumes about the bond forming between them. Emma nestled against Atlas's body, and then, in a voice so quiet that almost missed it, she spoke. "My daddy doesn't live with us anymore." The words were barely audible, a whisper that seemed to take immense effort to produce. But they were words, real words, actual communication breaking through the wall of silence that had surrounded Emma for nearly a month. Felt his eyes welling with tears. Dr. Reeves's hand came up to cover her mouth in surprise. Atlas didn't react to the words themselves, but the dog did something subtle. He adjusted his position slightly, turning his body to create a more protective cradle around Emma's small frame. The dog's breathing synchronized with hers, as if Atlas was literally supporting her with his physical presence. "I don't want to talk about it," Emma continued, her voice gaining slightly more volume. "But I don't want to not talk about it either. I want. She trailed off, her small face scrunched in concentration as she searched for words adequate to describe her emotional landscape. Atlas pressed his muzzle against her cheek, a gesture of encouragement that seemed to give Emma the strength to continue. "I want it to hurt less," she finally whispered. "I want to not feel like I'm disappearing." In the observation room, Dr. Reeves set down her clipboard and turned to with an expression of professional wonder. She's articulating her experience. She's moving from complete dissociation to actual emotional processing. This is extraordinary progress. But wasn't thinking about clinical progress. He was thinking about the fact that a 7-year-old girl had found her voice not through therapy or medication or forced interaction, but through connection with a dog who understood what it meant to suffer in silence. Over the following weeks, Emma came to the counseling office every Tuesday and Thursday, and sometimes on Mondays when she was having particularly difficult days. Each session lasted an hour, and during that hour, Emma gradually began to talk more. She spoke about missing her father. She spoke about feeling like she'd somehow caused the separation through her own failure to be enough to keep her parents together. She spoke about the terror of her new school, and the shame of being the silent girl that everyone whispered about. And with each confession, Atlas remained present. The dog's physical proximity created a container for Emma's pain, a safe space where nothing she said would be judged, where her words wouldn't damage the one hearing them, where emotion could exist without consequence. Dr. Reeves documented the sessions meticulously, noting Emma's increasing verbosity, her improving facial expressions, the way her body language was becoming less rigid and closed off. But more importantly, she noted something that couldn't be in clinical terms. Emma was healing. And Atlas was healing too. The dog's transformation was equally remarkable. His appetite had returned to normal. His coat had regained its luster. The distance in his eyes had been replaced by clarity and purpose. Officer brought Atlas in for his behavioral reassessment during the 4th week, and the attending veterinarian noted improvements in every category. "Whatever you're doing with this dog, keep doing it," the vet had said, studying Atlas's improved vitals and responsive demeanor. "I haven't seen a recovery this dramatic in my 15 years of practice." What Dr. Reeves understood, what Principal had begun to recognize, was that healing wasn't a solitary journey. It wasn't something that happened in isolation, through willpower or medication or professional intervention alone. Healing happened when two broken beings recognized each other across the distance of their separate pain and chose connection anyway. Healing happened when silence became a language understood between species and trauma. Healing happened when a dog and a girl discovered that they weren't alone in their breaking, and that sometimes the only word that mattered was presence. On a Friday afternoon after their 8th session, Emma stood up, put her arms around Atlas's neck, and in a voice that was still quiet but infinitely stronger than before, she said, "Thank you for understanding. Thank you for not leaving." Atlas's tail wagged with the certainty of a creature who had finally found his purpose again. And Emma walked out of that office carrying something she'd thought was lost forever: hope. The silence in Mrs. third-grade classroom was deafening. 23 children sat at their desks, pencils poised over math worksheets, completely focused on their problems. Emma stared at question number 7, her heart hammering in her chest with a force that seemed disproportionate to the simple arithmetic problem before her. 7 times 8, 56. She knew the answer. She'd known it for weeks. What she hadn't known, until this very moment, was whether she had the courage to raise her hand and speak it aloud. For the past month and a half, Emma had remained silent in Mrs. classroom. She'd completed all her work, earned solid grades through written assignments, participated through raised hands and nods, but she hadn't spoken a single word to her teacher or classmates. Not since arriving at Riverside Elementary as the broken child of a broken family. But now, something inside her was different. The sessions with Atlas had created a shift in her internal landscape, subtle but unmistakable. She could feel it in her chest, in the way her breathing had become less shallow, in the way the constant knot of anxiety in her stomach had loosened slightly. Every Tuesday and Thursday she'd sit with Atlas, and the dog's calm presence had whispered a truth her therapist couldn't quite articulate. She wasn't invisible. Her voice mattered. Her pain was valid, and sharing it wouldn't destroy everyone around her. Mrs. was moving around the classroom, checking on students' progress. She was an older woman with kind eyes and an infinite well of patience. She'd been the first teacher to notice Emma's silence without immediately pathologizing it, without pressuring, without the desperate concern that made Emma feel like an emergency to be managed rather than a child to be understood. When Mrs. reached Emma's desk, she smiled gently. "How are you doing with number 7, Emma?" Emma's mouth went dry. Her hand trembled slightly. Every eye in the classroom suddenly felt like it was trained on her. Her throat constricted, and for a moment the familiar paralysis threatened to reclaim her. But then she remembered Atlas's steady breathing, his patient presence, the way the dog had never once demanded that she speak, but somehow made speaking feel safe. Emma's hand shot up. The classroom went quiet. Children turned in their seats. Mrs. eyebrows rose slightly with surprise and something else, hope, perhaps, or recognition of a significant moment. "Yes, Emma?" the teacher asked softly. Emma opened her mouth. Her voice came out hoarse from disuse, barely more than a croak, but it was there. It was real. It was hers. 56, she said. The word hung in the air like a small miracle. That's correct, Mrs. said, and her smile widened. Excellent work. But what struck Emma most powerfully was the complete absence of fanfare. Mrs. didn't make a huge deal out of it. She didn't call attention to the fact that Emma had just spoken for the first time in weeks. She simply acknowledged the correct answer and moved on to the next student. The ordinariness of the moment, the lack of judgment, the normalization of Emma's participation made it somehow more meaningful. Over the following week, Emma raised her hand 3 more times. She answered questions about spelling, about science, about historical facts. Her voice was still quiet, still hesitant, but it was getting stronger. The other children stopped staring. The teachers stopped looking surprised. Emma was becoming, gradually and tentatively, a participant in the world again. That Friday afternoon, Emma's mother picked her up from school as usual. Had aged years in the past 2 months. The separation from Emma's father had carved lines into her face, had turned her eyes perpetually red and swollen from crying. She worked 2 jobs now, trying to make the rent on the new apartment, trying to create stability for a daughter who'd lost the foundational stability of her family structure. "How was school?" asked, the question automatic, the expectation of an answer already lowered to accommodate Emma's silence. Emma was quiet for a moment as her mother pulled out of the parking lot. Then she said, "I raised my hand today, in math class." His hands jerked slightly on the steering wheel. She nearly ran a red light. When she regained control of the vehicle, she pulled over to the curb abruptly, parked, and turned to face her daughter with tears already streaming down her face. You spoke," his voice broke. "You participated in class." "I answered a math question," Emma confirmed, her own eyes becoming wet. "Mrs. asked me, and I answered, and then I raised my hand 3 more times this week." Reached over and pulled her daughter into a fierce embrace, her entire body shaking with sobs of relief and joy, and the release of tension she'd been holding for weeks. Emma pressed her face against her mother's shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of her mother's perfume mixed with the smell of her office building. "I'm so proud of you," whispered into Emma's hair, "so incredibly proud." They sat like that for several minutes, the car idling on the side of the road, mother and daughter beginning to find their way back to each other through the wreckage of their family's dissolution. Meanwhile, on the other side of town, Atlas was undergoing his formal behavioral reassessment at the police department's veterinary clinic. Doctor conducted a series of tests designed to evaluate the dog's responsiveness, focus, and psychological stability. Stood to the side, watching as his partner moved through the evaluation with a confidence and clarity that had been absent for so long. Atlas responded to commands with immediate obedience. The dog's focus was sharp, his movements precise and purposeful. When presented with distracting stimuli, Atlas maintained his concentration on his handler. When exposed to recorded sounds designed to test for anxiety responses, the dog remained calm and steady. Doctor completed her evaluation and looked up from her clipboard with an expression of genuine amazement. "I have to tell you, I've never seen a recovery this complete. 6 weeks ago, I was discussing end-of-life options. Today, I'm looking at a dog in optimal physical and psychological condition. Whatever you did, it worked." "I didn't do anything," said quietly. "He found what he needed on his own." Doctor smiled, understanding more than had explicitly stated. The behavioral score is higher than it was before the incident, significantly higher. Atlas is cleared for full duty. More than cleared, he's actually performing better than baseline. That evening, Captain called into his office. The captain sat behind his desk, studying a report, and when he looked up, his expression was difficult to read. "Your dog passed the reassessment," said without preamble. "Perfect scores across the board. The vet says Atlas is actually in better condition than before the trauma." "Yes, sir," replied. "Which means the department's budget for the K-9 unit isn't getting cut, which means the program continues, which means other officers, other dogs, they all benefit from the fact that you refuse to give up on your partner. Leaned back in his chair. I also heard an interesting story from Principal at Riverside Elementary. She says Atlas has been instrumental in helping a nonverbal child begin speaking again. She says it's the most remarkable psychological recovery she's witnessed in 15 years of education. Felt heat rise in his cheeks. He hadn't known that Principal had connected the dots so thoroughly. That's really good to hear, sir. Smiled a genuine smile that transformed his stern face. It's very good to hear, because it reminds me why we do this work, not for budgets or statistics or public relations. We do it because it matters, because sometimes a dog and a child can remind each other how to live. The captain stood and extended his hand. Good work, you and Atlas, you did something special. Two broken beings had found each other, and in the finding they'd healed. Not completely, healing was ongoing, a process rather than a destination, but significantly, meaningfully, in a way that changed the trajectory of both their lives and proved that sometimes transformation requires nothing more than presence and the willingness to sit with another's pain. The article appeared in the Riverside Daily Chronicle on a Wednesday morning, buried on page 7 beneath headlines about local zoning disputes and school board meetings. The headline was simple: Silent Girl Finds Her Voice Through Police Dog. It was a human interest story, the kind of feel-good content that newspapers ran to balance out the heavier news cycles. The journalist, a woman named Summers, had interviewed Principal Dr. Reeves, an officer. She'd captured the essence of Emma and Atlas's connection in roughly 800 words, a story about trauma, healing, and the unexpected bonds that form between broken souls. Didn't expect it to go viral. But by Thursday evening, the article had been shared over 4,000 times on social media. By Friday morning, it had been picked up by a regional news station. By Saturday, national news outlets were calling the police department, requesting interviews, wanting to tell the story of the police dog and the silent child on television broadcasts that would reach millions of viewers. Received the first call from a producer at a major network around 9 in the morning on Saturday. He was off duty, sitting in his living room with Atlas's head resting on his lap, when Captain called and informed him that his story was about to become public property. "They want to do a feature," said over the phone, his tone carrying a mixture of pride and concern. 30 minutes on the evening news magazine show. You, the girl, the dog, the whole narrative. Are you willing to do this? His first instinct was to decline. He was a private person, uncomfortable with attention, protective of both Atlas and Emma. But then he thought about what Principal had told him. This story could help people understand that healing doesn't follow a linear path. It could help other children feel less alone. "Let me talk to Emma's mother first," said. "If she's willing, I'm willing." Emma's mother cried when explained the media interest over the phone. She was overwhelmed, uncertain, protective of her daughter. But when she asked Emma what she thought about telling their story to the world, Emma had responded with a quiet certainty. Maybe other kids who can't talk will know they're not alone. The interview was conducted the following week at Riverside Elementary. A film crew set up cameras in the gymnasium where this entire journey had begun. Emma sat on the bleachers with Atlas beside her, her small hand resting on the dog's shoulder. The interviewer, a woman with kind eyes and a gentle demeanor, asked Emma about her experience, about the moment she first connected with Atlas, about what the dog had meant to her healing. Emma spoke for 10 minutes straight, the longest she'd spoken to anyone other than Atlas and her therapist. She talked about the pain of her parents' separation, about the fear that came with being unable to speak, about the loneliness of watching other children laugh and play while she remained trapped in silence. She talked about the moment she realized that Atlas understood her pain, that the dog wasn't trying to fix her, wasn't demanding that she speak, was simply sitting with her in the breaking. "Atlas showed me that it was okay to be broken," Emma said, her young voice carrying a wisdom that seemed far beyond her 7 years. He was broken too, and we were broken together, and that made it okay. By the following evening, the story had aired nationally. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed over 2 million times on various news websites and social media platforms. The comments section was flooded with responses from people who'd experienced selective mutism, from parents of traumatized children, from animal lovers, from people who'd simply been moved by the narrative of two beings finding healing in each other. But the response that mattered most came in a different form: letters. Dozens of them arrived at the police department and at Riverside Elementary, all addressed to Emma or Officer or simply to the police dog and the little girl. A woman from Oregon wrote about her daughter, who'd also stopped speaking after her parents' separation and had begun speaking again after they'd adopted a therapy dog. A man from Texas described his own journey with depression, stating that Emma and Atlas's story had inspired him to seek help after years of silent suffering. A child from Pennsylvania wrote in crayon, explaining that she also couldn't talk but now knew she wasn't alone because of Emma. Dr. Reeves organized a reading of the letters in her office with Emma present. As each letter was opened and read aloud, Emma's eyes grew wider, her understanding of her own significance expanding in real time. She wasn't just a quiet child at a small elementary school. She was a symbol, a beacon, a voice, ironically, for countless voiceless individuals who'd recognized themselves in her story. But the ripple effect extended beyond individual responses. Principal, buoyed by the national attention and inspired by Emma's recovery, approached the school board with a proposal to establish a formal animal-assisted therapy program at Riverside Elementary. She advocated for the hiring of a part-time animal behaviorist and the recruitment of specially trained therapy dogs to work alongside the school's counseling staff. The proposal was approved within a month. By the following academic year, Riverside Elementary had become one of the first public schools in the state to offer structured animal-assisted therapy as part of its mental health services. The program served children dealing with selective mutism, anxiety, depression, and trauma. Dr. Reeves oversaw the implementation, ensuring that the dogs were carefully selected, properly trained, and ethically treated. Atlas became an unofficial ambassador for the program, though kept him focused primarily on police work rather than allowing him to become a full-time therapy dog. The story also inspired conversations about mental health and trauma recovery in Emma's community and beyond. Parents began asking questions about their own children's emotional. Teachers requested training on recognizing signs of anxiety and depression in students. The local hospital established a mental health awareness campaign featuring artwork inspired by Emma and Atlas's journey. News outlets from around the country sent camera crews to film follow-up stories. Psychology professors began using Emma and Atlas's case study in their lectures about trauma and animal-assisted therapy. A documentary filmmaker approached about developing a feature-length film about the dog and the girl. Academic journals published peer-reviewed articles examining the neurobiological impacts of animal companionship on children with selective mutism. What had begun as a chance encounter in a gymnasium had transformed into a movement, a quiet but powerful shift in how the community understood healing, silence, and the possibility of connection across boundaries of species and suffering. 6 months after the initial news story broke, received an invitation to speak at a national conference on animal-assisted therapy. He was asked to share Atlas's story, to discuss the behavioral changes he'd observed, to explain how a working police dog had become an instrument of healing for a traumatized child. As prepared his presentation, he realized something profound. The story wasn't really about him, and it wasn't really about Atlas. It was about what happened when two broken beings refused to remain isolated in their breaking. It was about the power of presence, the healing that came not from words but from witness, the transformation that occurred when one being saw another and said, without speaking, "You are not alone." And in a world that often felt fragmented and lonely, that message was spreading like light through darkness, one story at a time, one person at a time, one rescued heart at a time. The police station auditorium was packed with over 300 people. News cameras lined the back wall, their red recording lights blinking steadily. Local officials, school administrators, community leaders, and members of the media filled every available seat. On the stage, a large banner read, "Commendation Ceremony, Officer and Atlas Service Beyond Duty." But the person everyone was really waiting to see was the small girl who'd begun speaking again. Emma sat backstage in a room filled with flowers, cards, and gifts from well-wishers around the country. She wore a navy dress with a white collar, her fancy dress, as she called it, and her long dark hair was styled with care by her mother, who sat beside her, holding her hand. Eyes were red from crying, but they were happy tears, the kind that came from witnessing the transformation of your child from a silent shadow into a radiant presence in the world. "Are you nervous?" asked, squeezing Emma's hand gently. Emma shook her head. "Atlas will be there, right?" "He'll be there," assured her. "Officer promised." Emma nodded, accepting this certainty. She'd learned over the past year that some things could be relied upon. Atlas would be there. Officer would be there. The people who loved her wouldn't disappear or shatter the way her family structure had. Healing had taught her that safety was possible, even when the world had proven itself capable of breaking. 1 year had passed since that gymnasium assembly. 12 months of consistent, remarkable change. Emma was no longer the silent child who ate lunch alone and watched other children from a distance. She'd become a 4th grader who participated in class discussions, who had friends, who joined the school choir and performed in the winter concert. She still had quiet moments. She was introverted by nature, and the trauma had left certain marks that would probably never completely disappear. But she'd reclaimed her voice, and more importantly, she'd reclaimed her sense of possibility. Atlas had his own transformation. The police dog who'd been on the verge of 1 year ago was now a decorated officer with commendations for both police work and community service. His behavioral reassessment scores had remained consistently high. He'd participated in 15 successful narcotics detection operations. But more significantly, Atlas had become a symbol, the living proof that trauma didn't have to be permanent, that breaking didn't have to be fatal, that healing was possible even when the wound seemed irreversible. Officer stood backstage as well, checking his uniform for the 100th time. He looked different than he had a year ago. The lines around his eyes had softened slightly. His shoulders were less rigidly tensed. He'd started seeing a therapist after the initial crisis with Atlas had passed, and he'd come to understand that his own trauma, the incident that had nearly cost him his life, had never been properly processed. Sitting with Atlas through the dog's recovery had opened something in that had been sealed shut for 6 months. He'd allowed himself to grieve, to feel fear, to acknowledge that survival didn't mean healing had automatically followed. Principal David appeared backstage with his clipboard. "We're ready whenever you are," he said to Emma. "You look absolutely beautiful. Are you ready to go out there?" Emma stood up, taking a deep breath. "I'm ready." The doors to the auditorium opened, and the crowd stood up in anticipation. Officer walked out first in his dress uniform with Atlas at his side. The dog was impeccably groomed, his coat shining, his bearing dignified and proud. The audience applauded. News cameras flashed. Then Emma walked out, holding her mother's hand, and the applause intensified. She walked to the center of the stage, where a podium had been set up. At the microphone, she paused, taking a moment to look out at the sea of faces. A year ago, she couldn't have imagined standing here. A year ago, she couldn't have imagined speaking at all. "My name is Emma," she began, her voice clear and steady, "and a year ago I stopped talking." A hush fell over the auditorium. People leaned forward, drawn in by the narrative they'd heard about but never quite understood until hearing Emma speak it herself. I stopped talking because my parents got separated, and I thought if I didn't speak, I wouldn't have to accept that it was real. I thought silence would protect me, but silence doesn't protect you. Silence just makes you lonelier. Emma paused, looking toward Atlas. Then I met a dog who was also lonely, a dog who was also broken, and Atlas showed me that you don't have to be okay to be loved. You don't have to be fixed to be worthy. You just have to be present. Felt tears streaming down his face. In the audience was openly sobbing. Atlas didn't try to make me talk, Emma continued. He didn't judge me for being silent. He just sat with me while I was hurting, and that made all the difference. Because knowing someone is sitting with you in the darkness, that makes the darkness less scary. That's when you can find your voice again. Emma stepped away from the podium, and the auditorium erupted in applause. She walked directly to Atlas and wrapped her arms around the dog's neck. Atlas's tail wagged with the joy of a creature who'd found his purpose, who discovered that his pain could be transformed into service, that his breaking could become the bridge that helped someone else find wholeness. Chief of Police William Torres took the podium and delivered remarks about Atlas's service record, his behavioral recovery, and his unofficial role in the community's mental health crisis. He presented Atlas with an official commendation medal, which was fastened to the dog's collar. He presented with a certificate of appreciation and a letter of commendation in his official file. But the most meaningful moment came when Emma was invited to the podium to present Atlas with a gift. She handed Officer a framed photograph of the two of them, Emma and Atlas sitting together on the gymnasium bleachers, the moment captured by a photographer who'd been present for one of the news interviews. In the photo, Emma's face was peaceful, her hand resting on Atlas's shoulder, and the dog's eyes were bright and present, fully alive. "This is for Atlas," Emma said into the microphone, "because he saved me, and because I want to remember forever the moment when I realized I wasn't alone." In that auditorium filled with 300 witnesses, something transcendent occurred. People who'd struggled with their own trauma recognized themselves. Parents who'd worried about their children's mental health saw a pathway forward. Other children who felt invisible or voiceless saw proof that silence wasn't permanent, that healing was possible, that connection could transform everything. After the ceremony, people lined up to speak with Emma and Atlas. A woman shared her story of selective mutism and how Emma's journey had inspired her to seek help. A man spoke about his service dog and how the animal had saved his life. A child reached out to pet Atlas, and the dog responded with the gentleness of a creature who understood that touch was a form of healing. As the evening drew to a close, and Emma stood together in a quieter corner of the auditorium, with Atlas between them, the dog rested his head against Emma's shoulder while she wrapped her arms around his neck. "Thank you," Emma whispered to the dog. Atlas's tail wagged slowly, the motion communicating something that didn't need words. "I see you. I know you. You matter." Officer watched the two of them together, the broken girl and the broken dog who'd found each other in a gymnasium 1 year ago, and through the simple act of presence and acceptance, had taught the world about healing. He thought about resilience, about the surprising strength that emerged from vulnerability, about the power of connection to transform suffering into meaning. Emma looked up at and smiled, not the forced, polite smile of a child trying to appear okay, but a genuine smile that reached her eyes and spoke of genuine peace. "Can Atlas keep coming to school?" she asked. Knelt down to Emma's level. "Atlas will be at school every week. That's a promise." Emma nodded, satisfied. She'd learned that some promises could be kept, that some beings would stay, that the breaking didn't have to be the end of the story. 1 year ago, a silent girl and a broken dog had found each other in a gymnasium. They'd healed each other not through words or therapy or the passage of time, but through the radical acceptance of each other's pain and the courageous choice to remain present in it. And in doing so, They'd reminded the world that sometimes the most powerful transformation happens not when we fix what's broken, but when we sit with it, witness it, and refuse to let it face the darkness alone. That was the real commendation. That was the true service. That was the evidence of a love that transcended species and trauma and time. In a gymnasium full of broken hearts learning to beat again, Atlas and Emma had taught everyone the language of healing, presence, acceptance, and the unwavering belief that no one has to remain alone in the breaking. They can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.